Imagine telling an ancient Athenian and an ancient Spartan that they were the same people. They might have laughed or drawn their swords. Because for most of early history, Greece did not exist. There were only rival cities and rival tribes, and they spent centuries at each other's throats. So how did the scattered, quarrelling people ever come to believe they were one family? The answer is one of the strangest stories in history, because in a sense, they made it up. Go back nearly 3,000 years, and the land we call Greece was a patchwork of hundreds of independent city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each with its own laws, its own army, its own fierce pride, and beneath them ran the old tribal names: Dorians, Ionians, Aeolians, Achaeans, groups who spoke differently, worshipped differently, and often despised one another. Here is a surprising part. Even Homer, the poet at the very root of Greek civilization, never calls his heroes Greeks. In the Iliad, the army at Troy is the Achaeans, the Danaans, the Argives. The word we translate as Greek, Hellenes, barely appears, because in Homer's day, Hellenes wasn't everyone. It was just the name of one small tribe in one corner of Thessaly. There was no word for all the Greeks, because there was no idea of all the Greeks. So how did that change? First, they invented a family. Greek storytellers built a grand family tree to explain who they were. At the very top, they placed a single ancestor, a man named Hellen. He was said to be the son of the Achaean, the Greek Noah, the king who survived the great flood that Zeus once sent to drown all of humanity. When the waters fell and the world began again, Hellen became the forefather of a new people, and they took his name. He had sons and grandsons: Doros, Aeolos, Ion, Achaeos, and from each one descended a tribe: the Dorians, the Aeolians, the Ionians, and the Achaeans. In other words, the Greeks didn't discover they were related. They worked themselves into a single family, every tribe a branch from one shared root. And they named that family after Hellen, Hellenes, the name the Greeks still call themselves to this day. Second, they built places to come together. They worshipped the same gods, and they gathered at shared sacred sites, none greater than Delphi, the oracle every Greek city consulted, and Olympia. In 776 BC, the Olympic Games began, and here is the key: only Greeks were allowed to compete. To enter, an athlete had to prove he was Hellenic. This rule was enforced so strictly that even kings from the northern edges of the Greek world had to submit their family trees to a panel of judges just to prove they were Greek enough to run. For a few days, a sacred truce silenced every war, and men who would otherwise meet on the battlefield met instead on the racetrack as members of the same people. The games weren't just sport, they were a ritual of belonging. Third, they defined themselves against everyone else. To a Greek ear, foreign languages like Persian or Egyptian didn't sound like actual speech. They sounded like sheep making a repetitive, meaningless noise, bar, bar, bar. So they called those people barbaroi, barbarians, literally the bubblers. To be Greek in part simply meant not one of them. But an idea is one thing. It took a catastrophe to make it real. In the early 5th century BC, a vast empire marched from the east. Persia, the largest power the world had yet seen, determined to swallow Greece whole. The danger was so overwhelming that even the sacred oracle at Delphi panicked, issuing terrifying prophecies telling the Greeks to flee to the ends of the earth. But for once, the rival cities ignored the gods and trusted each other instead. Facing total extinction, the impossible happened. Bitter rivals united. Athens and Sparta, enemies for generations, stood side by side. Suddenly, Greek against barbarian, was no longer just a story, it was survival, and against all odds, the Greeks won. In the years that followed, a historian named Herodotus set down for the first time what it actually meant to be Greek. To be Hellenic, he wrote, was to share four things: the same blood, the same language, the same gods and temples, and the same way of life. It was the first true definition of a people who had taken centuries to admit they were one. And yet, here's the twist. The Greeks realized they were a family. They never became a nation. The unity that defeated Persia shattered almost at once. Within a single generation, Athens and Sparta turned on each other and tore Greece apart in a brutal decades-long war. Their Greekness was never a government, never a flag, never a single state. It was shared gods, shared games, shared stories, and a shared ancestor they had invented. They were a family that refused to live under one roof. In the end, it took a Greek from the northern edge, Philip of Macedon, a king the proud southern cities looked down on as half wild, and his son Alexander the Great, to finally unite them by force. But even then, the old grudges remained. Sparta stubbornly refused to join Alexander's march into Asia. Alexander was so petty about the snub that after defeating the Persians, he sent hundreds of suits of enemy armor back to Athens with a famous inscription: Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks, except the Spartans, from the barbarians who inhabit Asia. A true unified Greek nation-state would not actually exist for another 2,000 years. They had always been one people. It just took them an enemy, a handful of games, and an ancestor they dreamed up to finally believe it.